Hi everybody, Dana Sparks back again, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors. This week's contract tip is a follow-up from last week's contract tip. We are talking about the sale or lease contingency of a buyer's home when they go under contract for a new home. Please watch the previous video that I've done on sale or lease contingency from a buyer's perspective, and that was part 1. This is part 2, and this is the sale or lease contingency from a seller's perspective. So I'm not going to reiterate the whole thing again. Please go watch the previous video on this. But there are a couple of issues I want to talk about from a seller's perspective so that you, as an agent representing the seller, protect the seller in this scenario. So buyer and seller, you have a listing, you get an offer from a buyer, but the buyer has a current home that they must sell before they are able to close on your listing, on your seller's listing. So the contract comes across and there is a contingency, an exhibit that the buyer's purchase of this home is contingent upon them selling or leasing, closing on or leasing their existing home by a certain date. And again, I go into a full explanation on that on the previous video. Then if there is a kick-out provision, so if you are representing a seller, you absolutely want to protect the seller by including the kick-out provision on this exhibit. If you are working with a buyer, you want to do everything you can to not have the kick-out exhibit. But regardless, if there is a kick-out exhibit, basically the backup, here we go. The sale or lease of buyer's property contingency is GAR Form F90. Again, these contingency, there are exhibits provided for you in the RE Forms contract package, but I am just discussing the GAR forms today. So in that sale or lease of buyer's property contingency exhibit, it does have a date that the buyer and the seller must agree upon, that the buyer has until that date to close on their current home or get a lease on it. Now, typically, not typically, but there are times when that date coincides with the closing date of this new home, so that a buyer does a back-to-back closing. So the time frame in the exhibit, that this exhibit is contingent upon the occurrence of the following, which would be the close of existing home or lease of existing home on or before date. A buyer would probably want to put in a date that coincides with this date so the buyer can do a back-to-back closing. The buyer closes on their current home, gets the proceeds, sends it to the closing attorney for this home, and then the buyer closes on this transaction with the seller. Now, from a seller's perspective, a seller might want to negotiate that the date of the closing of their current home happens a few days prior to the closing of this home. So if I'm a seller and I'm willing to accept a contract that a buyer has to sell their current home, I want to make sure that they close on that home before they close on this home so that there aren't any delays. Now, you and I both know there are potential delays, and sometimes there are not anything that we can do about it. But if there is a situation where you can potentially prevent it, that might be one way to handle that. Then there is the kick-out provision, and basically it says that you as the seller, you get to continue to market the property for active even though you're under contract with buyer A. If you get another offer that you want to accept, then you must send notice, and again, this is not agent-to-agent email. You must use the proper forms, the proper notice form, and it must reference this exhibit, and it must be signed by the seller. You send notice to the buyer, buyer A, that, hey, I got another offer I want to accept. I'm invoking the kick-out provision. You now have whatever the parties had negotiated. 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours, whatever, to let me know, are you able to go through with this purchase and remove all contingencies, and we'll go through, or are you going to terminate and then I can go on with buyer B and close with buyer B. So before you can do anything, you have to send that notice to the buyer, and then the buyer has the option, then the ball's in the buyer's court to let you know, Are they terminating or are they going through with it? Now, let's think about this. Before you as the seller invoke the kickout to a buyer with whom you are under contract, and you just have another offer you want to accept, you are putting yourself in a precarious position if you potentially send a kickout to the buyer A that you're already binding with, and buyer A is not in a position to go through with this home if they're kicked out. They're not in a position to remove the contingencies. They financially can't qualify, so they would have to terminate. Before you force that buyer that you're under contract with to terminate with you, don't do it just on an offer. So this is what, from a seller's perspective, you listing agents need to do to protect the seller. So you continue to market the property for active, you get another offer that the seller wants to accept. Well, here's how you deal with that. You go ahead and completely negotiate that second contract on this house. So not just an offer, but you would go back and forth, negotiate all the terms of the contract number 2. Then what you would do is you would go binding with contract number 2 as long as you use this. So you go binding with contract number 2, making it a backup contract. And the way you do that is you fully negotiate with buyer number 2 all the terms of the contract that you want to negotiate. Make sure that you use this backup contingency exhibit. And the GAR form for this is F91 Backup Agreement Contingency Exhibit. And what this does is, so you negotiate everything, and then it says buyer and seller acknowledge that this agreement is backup or secondary agreement to the primary agreement, which may be amended from time to time with a binding agreement date of blank, and between the seller and you state the buyer. So your seller, you're already under contract with a buyer that has a sale or lease contingency on in order to go through with this purchase. Get another offer, negotiate the other offer. You make this a backup. You reference the binding agreement date of the contract that you already have and the buyer's name. There can only be one binding backup. So listing agents that say, I've got several backups, that is just not a fact. They may have several interested parties, but you can only have one backup contract to a primary contract because you must identify the primary contract. So anyway, you are going to go ahead and go under contract with buyer number 2, making it a backup contract. And I have done videos on the backup contingency exhibit, so I'll put the link below here. But basically, you go under contract buyer number 2, making it a backup, and the buyer number 2 may terminate before they're notified that they're primary. Seller, protect yourself. Listing agents, protect your sellers. Go under contract with a backup. Then, at that point, then the seller is going to initiate the kickout with buyer number 1. Because if buyer number 1, with whom you're already binding, if they are not able to go through with this purchase because they must sell their current home in order to financially qualify for this home, don't put them in a position to terminate unless you have a true binding backup. So once you have a binding backup, then you send the notice exercising the kickout to buyer number 1. Then if buyer number 1 does terminate, then you send notice to buyer number 2. You are no longer in secondary position. You are now in primary position. And then you go through and close with buyer number 2. If you exercise binding backup with buyer number 2, send the kickout to primary buyer. Primary buyer says, yes, I'm staying through with this one. We're going on. Then buyer number 2, they still stay as a backup contract. So if something were to happen, because we know that there are times when things happen, if the primary contract, for whatever reason, even though all buyer contingencies are now removed, if something happens and it doesn't close, at that point, the seller can still send notice to the secondary contract that you're now primary. And again, it depends on the date. You're going to have to look at that exhibit that you go binding with. But what happens if you just And in the meantime, buyer number 2 can't always terminate. So buyer number 2, so it's a good deal for buyer number 2 also. They've got an offer on a house that they want, but they can terminate under no penalty and go for another house. But seller, think about it. If you, listing agents, if you just get an offer that you want to accept, you exercise a kick out to the binding contract, buyer number 1. Buyer number 1 comes back 48 hours, 72 hours, whatever time frame you negotiated, saying, hey, I'm terminating. They terminate. You now have a terminated contract. You then go back to buyer number 2 to get a binding contract if you didn't have a backup. Buyer number 2 says, nah, I changed my mind. I'm going on to something else, and they don't sign it. Seller is completely out. They had a binding contract. They kicked out the first one. Second one didn't go binding. Back on the market, starting from scratch. So that is just a little caveat to think about if you are representing a seller. If you're a listing agent, you have a contract, you're binding, but it has a sale or lease contingency exhibit. You get another offer. Make sure you secure offer number 2 with a contract, making it a binding backup contract using the backup contingency exhibit before you exercise that kick out to binding buyer number 1. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this contract tip did help you out. Please go watch that video tip that I did on the sale or lease contingency exhibit from the buyer's perspective. And thank you so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.